Have you ever made a sketch you were satisfied with, proceeded to color it immediately without any sort of plan, just figuring it out as you go? I've done that lots of times, and sometimes it turns out great, but sometimes it doesn't. It is precisely because of this that I make something that I can fall back on, and is easier to revise than a half-rendered painting. The color draft, which is like a coloring guide that helps me visualize even a small portion of what the final piece is gonna look like. In this video, I'm gonna demonstrate how this helps me out by going over the questions I ask myself when I make these color drafts. The very first thing I do when I make a color draft is to think of general questions. For example, if I want it cool or warm, if I want there to be more shadow than light, or the opposite. After I make sure that the shadow and light family are distinguishable from each other, I think of more specific questions, like how weak or strong the light is, where it's coming from, and how much shadow-light ratio I should have. I also think of my desired contrast level, whether I want to have strong contrast between character and background for a more distinguishable silhouette, or if I want a weaker contrast for a dreamy look. Considering all these things, I find that the most efficient way for me to experiment is by choosing the background color first, because the colors of the character are gonna be affected by the color of their surroundings. Additionally, color is relative, so a color that may be dark or just right on one color may be too light when placed next to another. When I get to the flat stage, I make my calculations about the colors. In this one, the background is a very saturated red, and I wanted my character's face to be in shadow for a dramatic look. When you look at the colors on her face, they're very dark, but they still lean towards red, because I decided I wanted her local colors to be affected very strongly by the red light from her surroundings. To give another example, this one has a saturated purple background, so I went with a pinkish hue for the skin. This is because her natural skin color is affected by her purple surroundings. But that doesn't mean I can't go with an orange-ish hue for some hue variation and contrast from all the cooler tones. But why does this still work? Because the values stay consistent, which is why I make it a habit to watch my values. I do this by making a color layer, filling it with black, and turning it on and off to see the illustration in black and white. I look at how readable the shapes are and assess if it's the atmosphere I wanted to portray. In this case, I wanted it to look more like nighttime, so I wanted most parts in shadow. Note that these steps aren't necessarily in order. Rather, these are just the things I think about when I choose colors. Making the big general decisions early on makes it easier for me to slowly move on to the smaller and more detailed ones, and it gives me clues as to how much I can improvise. That being said, sometimes I also postpone decisions for later, but I don't do this without making at least a small plan. For example, I may increase contrast later on using blending modes and editing tools, but it would be easier if I already had some colors to work with and adjust. Now, if you want to ask me how I come up with all these colors, I'd say it's a combination of lots of reference and the knowledge I have from studying and reading about color and value. I'm generally still not good at picking colors on the fly, so I'm not gonna talk about in-depth color theory or color schemes here because there are already a lot of really good resources out there. So instead, I'm just gonna talk about how I wing colors by experimentation and using reference. When I experiment, I mostly just pick colors that are close to each other on the wheel, like this color draft here, because that's what I'm somewhat used to. So when I want to make bold color choices or something that I've never done before, I'm gonna need input. And to do that, I need to use reference. Examples of good sources include film stills, photos, color palette generators, and even illustrations with an interesting color palette. What I usually do when I use references is I only take what I specifically want from my sources, and then I mix it with my own idea. That way, I don't 100% rely on or copy everything in one source. Even if I used some part of the source, at the end of the day, the reference is used in a transformative way. This is discussed in detail in ProCode's video about the reference sandwich, which is a good watch. When I go from color draft to rendering, you might ask how I don't steer too far from my original coloring plan. That's because when I start rendering, I focus on maintaining or working towards my original draft, especially my desired level of contrast. If ever I add anything like new colors, I try to work within the values I already have. I also like to keep a little window that contains the color draft for me to compare my progress with and help me stay on track. If I squint my eyes enough, the illustration and the color draft are pretty much gonna look the same, even if it's not finished yet. Of course, there are times when they are not entirely the same, like in this one, but that's usually just how it is when I realize that I want to add some more to the illustration in the middle or near the end of the process. That's why whenever I make a big decision that can alter everything, like the general contrast, I use adjustment layers so it's not finalized. Like what I said in my last video, I try to be careful about this by stepping away from my art for a while. The bottom line is, I treat the color draft as a guide and not a strict plan, much like the sketch. And that's pretty much it for this one. Have fun with experimenting and making your own color drafts.